to Politicking. I'm Larry King. ISIS continues to dominate headlines in the Western world. But what exactly is ISIS? Who's funding them? And can they be contained, or will their brand of terror soon reach American shores? My first guest has explored these questions and more in his latest terrific book, Rise of ISIS, A Threat We Can't Ignore. He's Jay Sekulow, Chief Counsel with the American Center for Law and Justice. All right, Jay, what are your thoughts about those attacks in France?
Well, Larry, thanks for having me. Well, the horrific is is an understatement. I think the targeted nature of what we saw take place in France goes away from this theory that these are one-offs or lone wolves. These are, in a very real sense, as one commentator said, these are packs. These are groups that have been trained. There was a coordinated attack here. And the fact of the matter is they're well-financed. This is very different than, although Al-Qaeda has shifted its strategy. They used to, remember, they were primarily hiding in caves, and then they would do these mass terrorist acts like they did in 9/11 in the United States, which took years and years of planning. Now they've moved out of the caves and are operating more like a military, which is much more like ISIS's approach. And there's a coordinated effort between these groups, and I think the reality is there's a common enemy, and that's Western civilization.
Except for the Boston incident, we haven't had anything hit our shores. How fearful are you of that happening here?
Look, I think we've got the greatest, one of the greatest intelligence systems in the world. We have a good counter-terrorism. But the fact of the matter is it does not take much. We have to be right 100% of the time. They only have to be right 1% of the time. If they pull one off, it's one too many. We did at Boston. I know there's been other attempts. We know that. We've seen that in the news. We've seen the reports from the FBI. But I think the reality is if we do not get this situation not contained but eliminated, I think we're going to see it in the United States. Look, we're the target here. Whether it was in France, it was the magazine, the satire magazine, that was the target. It was the Jewish Orthodox kosher grocery that was the target. But look, the big target here still is the United States, the West. We're their biggest obstacle for what their political agenda is.
Okay, you also say that Americans would be surprised to learn that joining Al-Qaeda or ISIS is not currently grounds to lose citizenship. Why not?
Yeah. We've got a loophole in the law, and the way it works right now, to have your citizenship revoked, you have to take up arms with a foreign state. That's one of the methods upon which, a basis upon which you could lose your citizenship. So if you take up arms with Syria, for instance, you could lose your citizenship. But neither Al-Qaeda nor, of course, ISIS are deemed foreign states. They are terrorist organizations. So the law really has to be changed to include terrorist organizations. And, Larry, frankly, that's not that complicated.
All right, Jay, we have freedom of speech. An American can stand on a corner and say, I like ISIS. What would they have to do to lose the citizenship?
Right. Well, right now you'd have to actually, to go through a citizenship revocation proceeding, speaking in favor of ISIS or advocating on behalf of ISIS ideas are not the basis of a revocation of citizenship. To have your citizenship revoked, what I've talked about is you need to modify the law to catch up with the current state of affairs. And that state of affairs are that you've got a situation with groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They're not states. They're not foreign states. But they are basically military armies. So if you take up arms with them, you simply add to the designation that exists right now in the law. You just simply very clearly say foreign states or designated terrorist organization. And the State Department already has a designated terrorist organization list. So you just would add that. It's really 4 words to a statute, solves the problem.
You've said President Obama's approach to combating terrorism is a proven failure. How?
Well, I mean, let's look at we've kind of picked, the president's picked kind of the wrong sides in just about every single situation. The Middle East is a difficult and unfolding situation. Former Prime Minister of Great Britain, Benjamin Disraeli, said the pursuit of the Middle East is a lifelong attempt, and it doesn't generally end successfully. I mean, it's a troubled region of the world. But you've got to be able to name your enemy here, and we have to call this what it is. And the fact of the matter is, while not all Muslims are terrorists by any stretch of the imagination. The reality is what we're dealing with globally right now, those terrorists at least identify themselves as Muslim. And I think you have to, as Prime Minister David Cameron said, call it what it is. It's radical jihadism, Islamic terrorists. We have to be able to identify the enemy in order to eliminate it. And there's no containment here, Larry. You can't, this is not a situation where you can contain this. This has to be eliminated. It may take more military than we're willing to commit right now. But ISIS, by the way, if you look at ISIS and Hamas in the region, you've got between both of those groups about 80,000 standing army. That is the army of a state. And I think that's what we've got to be really careful of what we're dealing with here. Very different than simply al-Qaeda.
So it's not just semantics to you.
It's not. I think, Larry, we've got to confront a situation where we've got a guy that's running ISIS that's trying to establish, whether we like it or want to acknowledge it or not, he's attempting to establish a global caliphate. That's what Caliph Ibrahim has said. Now, this guy, and the president needs to understand this, the president doesn't think that this is a war with radical Islam, but tell that to Sheikh Ibrahim, because he sure thinks it is. And I think the reality is that we've got to realize this is an intergenerational conflict we're dealing with right now, and it's going to take a concerted effort of the free world. Especially, we can't lead from behind in a situation like this. We've got to lead to dismantle and destroy. And I don't think we've got years and years to do this before it's on our shores. I mean, I think right now, as we're sitting here talking about this, I am sure, without question, there are cell groups that are desiring to do harm to the United States of America. We hear that every day.
More with Jay Sekulow right after this. The president is not a stupid man. Why do you think he doesn't label it the way you want him to label it?
No, I think the president's a bright guy. I'm not saying, I just think that the issue here is he has a narrative. And that narrative, when he got elected the first time, was that he was going to be able to change the way the United States perceived globally, but specifically in the Muslim or Arab world. That's been the narrative. So anything that counters that narrative, he doesn't want to advocate, and labeling something Islamic radicalism would counter that narrative. So I think it's not semantics for him either. It's a worldview that the president has that he's implementing through his foreign policy, through the State Department, and I think that in and of itself is creating part of the problem here. It's naive to think, and the president's not naive. It's naive for us to think that the president doesn't have a calculated plan. It's just a lot of us have a fundamental disagreement with how that plan is being implemented and what that plan really entails.
The Pentagon recently announced that the United States military is planning to send more than 400 American soldiers training Syrian rebels to fight the Islamic State. What are your thoughts on that mission?
Right. Well, here's you go. The president was calling for the Assad regime to be overturned not too long ago, and now it's between Assad and ISIS. It's kind of pick your poison. I mean, who's the worst here? And is it the devil you know is better than the one you don't? So I think right now destabilizing Assad, the regime there, doesn't do anything to advance the cause. I think putting Americans that can work with counterinsurgency groups is smart. There's probably a lot more than 400. I know that's what the Pentagon's saying, but I'm sure there's plans for more as needed. But I think, Larry, it's going to take everything we have. I believe, I said this in the book Rise of ISIS, we can win this. We can beat ISIS. We can beat Hamas. We can beat al-Qaeda. We just have to have the will to do it. And the will to do it means when you're leading the free world, you've got to be able to change direction. When something is not going according to plan, come up with a new plan.
You have described the Islamic State, ISIS, as, your quote, the wealthiest and most lethal terrorist group in history.
Yep.
How did it get to be the wealthiest?
Well, they took over, they were smart. They took over cities and took over assets. So in some towns, in cities that they conquered, and that's what they did, it's a conquer mentality, they took over the banking system, they took over the money. They've got oil revenue, probably flowing through Turkey, supposedly our NATO ally, which raises a whole host of questions when you're dealing with Turkey now. So they've got a constant flow of cash that's not simply coming from some supporter in a Gulf state region of the Middle East. They've got operating businesses, oil revenue that their reports are could be $2 or $3 million a day. They've taken over banks, they've taken over antiquities where they've sold those. They're in the ransom business. We know that. They're calling for, was it $200 million in ransoms for 2 Japanese citizens that have been taken by ISIS. I mean, they're operating as a business, and they've got a constant flow of cash funds, and they're not simply relying on the largesse of supporters, so to speak. They are when they take over a town, they're taking over the business of that town as well.
All right. There's a terrorist born every minute, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think multiples a minute. Yep.
How do you defeat them? I mean, it has to be troops on the ground, has to be a war. How do you defeat them?
You've got to win them both militarily, but you got to win the ideology. I mean, the free world needs to shine a spotlight. And it happened a little bit in France. You saw that. You saw Muslim leaders finally starting to speak out of this, because for the Muslim world, these events, for those that are not radical jihadists, which is most of the Muslim world is not that, this event in France was horrific. And it was horrific for how they're perceived, and people were calling for, including the leaders of many governments, were calling for an internal cleansing within Islam itself. And I think that the ideology has to change. But that means they cannot teach in their books, in the madrasas, in the schools, to kill Jews, to have the blood of Jews flowing in the streets of Jerusalem, to kill the West, that we're the great Satan. You can't allow that ideology either. So it's both a military, it's a political, and it's an ideological battle, which is complicated, granted. But I think, when you're running the free world, you got to be able to do three things at the same time. The president's certainly capable. He's got 2 more years to solve this mess, or it gets handed on to the next president and to another generation. And I'm a grandfather. I shudder to think what this means, for generations down the road if we don't end this.
ISIS uses social media. Can the United States combat it on the internet?
Very effectively.
Can they combat it on the internet?
Well, the group Anonymous said they were going to shut all of their websites down. Look, you're right, Larry. They are very effective in social media. This is where, again, very different than Al-Qaeda, very different in the approach that they're taking to some of these groups. They're using social media, and they're using it. We see these beheadings in the West, and we're repulsed. They're showing those videos of the beheadings as a recruiting tool, and they're getting recruits. So how do you control the social media? They can work around it. There's no doubt about it. But you've got to combat it in the ideological battle, which means you got to take it right back at them in the social media. Maybe some of these governments will close down their access points. I mean, we wouldn't let the Nazis, if they had access in their time to this kind of medium, we wouldn't let the Nazis have this kind of medium access. These groups are no different. I mean, their desire is exactly and precisely the same. They've got a lethality capability that is also very dramatic here. And I think we've got to do everything we can to shut down their... Look, when you're fighting an enemy, it's not a free speech question. It's not a criminal question. It's a military question. Of course, what are the first things you do in a military engagement? You shut down the enemy's ability to communicate.
You do not sound optimistic.
I'm concerned. I mean, I'm concerned as an American. I'm concerned as a second generation of my family born in the United States. My family came from Russia, Larry. My grandfather was a fruit peddler in Brooklyn, New York. I was born in Brooklyn. And, I think about the country we now have and what we're dealing with. I'm not talking about the politics here. I'm talking about the great desire of these groups to destroy our way of life. And I'm looking at this as I'm almost 60 years old as kind of the mission here. I mean, I want to do everything I can in the legal realm, in the political realm, in the media, and that's why I was thrilled to be on your broadcast, your program. We've got to address this. We can't just hand this off to my sons and daughters-in-law and to my grandson. You just can't do that. You've got to be able to combat this. And my optimism is we're the United States of America. We've been able to overcome adversity in the past. That's our great strength. We've got to, it's hard 10 years into a war to keep motivating yourself to engage in this. But, Larry, this is like the 30-year war or the 1,000-year war. I mean, we're going to have to fight this until this enemy's done.
Thanks so much, Jay. Great. We look forward to having you back soon.
Thanks, Larry. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Jay Sekulow, the book, Rise of ISIS, A Threat We Cannot Ignore.